The invitation came in a group text, not a phone call, not even a direct message. A group text, sent to 11 people at once, with my name buried somewhere between my uncle's girlfriend and a cousin I hadn't seen in 4 years. I stared at it for a long time before I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and went back to making coffee. I should have known then, something had already shifted. I just didn't want to see it. My in-laws had money the way some families have weather. It was just always there, always shaping everything, and you learned not to comment on it. My father-in-law had built a regional logistics company from a single truck and 40 years of 6-day work weeks. My mother-in-law had kept the books, raised 2 kids, entertained clients, and never once let anyone forget that the success belonged to both of them. By the time I married their son, the company had 17 locations across 5 states and the valuation that made the number feel unreal when I first heard it. My husband, I'll call him that because that's what he was, even when things got complicated. He was the older child, steady, careful, the kind of man who read contracts before signing them and kept a spreadsheet for the household budget. I loved that about him once. Later, I would think about how that same carefulness had turned into something else entirely. I came from a different kind of family. My mother worked doubles at a hospital for most of my childhood. We weren't poor exactly, but we understood what it meant when the transmission went out in October and there was no backup plan. I put myself through school, got a degree in healthcare administration, worked my way into a direct position at a mid-sized clinic network by the time I was 29. I was proud of that. I thought they were too. Turns out pride looks different depending on whose name is on the building. The dinner was at the main house, what the family called it, like there were satellite locations. It was October Sunday, the kind where the sky goes pale and flat, and the leaves have mostly fallen and everything smells like cold mud and wood smoke. My mother-in-law had set the group text on Thursday, 4 days' notice for what was described as a family update dinner. No other details. My husband said it was probably about the company restructuring. He'd heard through his sister that their father had been meeting with a financial advisor. I asked if he thought we should be worried. He said no. He said it like he was closing a door. We drove out together, 40 minutes. I remember watching the exit signs and counting them the way I used to count ceiling tiles in waiting rooms when I was a kid. Something to do with my hands. Something to make the time feel like it had a structure. When we pulled into the driveway, my sister-in-law's car was already there, along with 2 I didn't recognise. My husband said they probably belonged to the advisors. He said it like that was normal, like advisors at a Sunday family dinner made perfect sense. Inside, the house smelled like it always did. Cedar and something floral, expensive candles. My mother-in-law ordered from a place in Connecticut. The dining table had been extended. There were name cards. I found mine near the end, between my husband and an empty chair. I noticed my sister-in-law was seated next to her mother, right at the centre. I noticed my father-in-law was at the head, which was usual. I noticed there were 2 men I didn't know seated to his left, both in blazers, both with legal pads open in front of them. I remember thinking, nobody brings legal pads to a family dinner. I asked my husband quietly if he knew who they were. He said their names. I didn't recognise them. He said they were with a firm his father had been working with. I asked what kind of firm. He said estate planning. And then he looked away. That was the moment. I can trace everything back to that look. Not the words, the look. The small, controlled way he moved his eyes away from mine like he already knew what was in the room and had decided not to tell me. The dinner itself was almost normal. My mother-in-law had done a roast. There was bread from the bakery she liked, the sourdough with a dark crust. Someone had put out a cheese board that nobody touched. The 2 men in blazers didn't eat much. They kept checking something on their phones under the table and exchanging looks I wasn't supposed to notice. My sister-in-law talked about her kids' school schedules. My husband talked about a project at work. My father-in-law asked me how things were going at the clinic and I said, fine, good, we were expanding the cardiology department. He nodded and said that was great. He seemed tired. Or maybe not tired. Careful. The same word I'd used for my husband. I didn't know then that it was the same carefulness, aimed at the same thing. Dessert with apple cake. My mother-in-law's recipe, the one she made every fall, the one I had asked her for twice and never received. She put it on the table and said, "Before we have this, your father wants to say a few words." Everyone got very still. My father-in-law stood. He held a piece of paper, but he didn't look at it much. He talked about the company. He talked about legacy and intention and wanting to ensure clarity going forward. He talked about the restructuring in a way that made it sound like nothing was changing, just being formalized. He used words like continuity and alignment and the phrase protecting what we built. I listened to every word. I understood maybe half of what he was actually saying. Then one of the men in blazers opened a folder. There were documents, one for my husband, one for my sister-in-law, one that was slid across the table toward me slowly like they were being careful about something. I looked at the top of the page. The header had the name of the firm. Below it, my name. Below that, a title I had to read 3 times before it made sense. Spousal consent and waiver of interest. Non-family member. My husband was looking at the cheese board. I sat there for a moment. Just a moment. Then I said quietly, "What is this?" My mother-in-law said, "It's just paperwork, sweetheart. It doesn't change anything day to day." I said, "It says I'm waiving interest in a family trust." My father-in-law said, "It's standard. For non-blood family members, the attorneys recommended it." Non-blood family members, I had been married to their son for 6 years. I had spent 6 Thanksgivings at that table. I had driven my mother-in-law to her mammogram appointment when my father-in-law had a conflict and my husband was travelling. I had sat in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours with a cup of bad coffee and a magazine I didn't read. Non-blood family member. I said, "I'd like to have my own attorney look at this before I sign anything." The room changed. It didn't get loud, it got quiet in a different way. My sister-in-law picked up her fork and put it down. My husband finally looked at me. His expression was something I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had and just hadn't named it correctly. It was irritation, but underneath it was something more like relief. Like he'd been waiting for me to be the problem. My mother-in-law said, "We really hoped we could handle this within the family." I said, "I am family." Nobody answered that. My father-in-law said the attorneys could answer any questions I had. I said I was sure they could, and that I would also be consulting my own counsel. He nodded once, the nod of a man who'd already prepared for this possibility. After dessert, which I didn't eat, my husband and I drove home mostly in silence. About 15 minutes in, he said it would have been easier if I'd just signed. I said easier for who? He said for everyone. I said that wasn't an answer. He didn't speak again until we got home. Over the next week, I had the documents reviewed by an attorney a colleague had referred me to, a woman who specialised in family law and marital assets. She sat across from me with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and went through the pages carefully. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me. She said, "If you sign this, you are releasing any claim to a trust currently valued at approximately $4.3 million, your husband's projected share. You're also acknowledging that in the event of divorce, any inheritance he receives would be classified entirely as separate property, not subject to division." I asked if that was normal. She said it wasn't uncommon. She also said it was unusual to present it this way at a family dinner, without prior notice, without giving the spouse any opportunity to seek independent counsel beforehand. I asked if there was any reason they might want this signed quickly. She paused. Then she said, "Is there anything you're not telling me?" There wasn't. Not then. I went home and I sat with it. I didn't sign. I told my husband I needed more time. He said his parents were asking. I said they could keep asking. Something was happening to us in real time and I could feel it, but I couldn't yet see the whole shape of it. 3 weeks later, I found out my husband had opened a separate bank account 8 months earlier. I didn't find this out from him. I found it the way you find most things you were never supposed to know, by accident, and then all at once. A statement misfiled. A number I didn't recognise. A conversation with my own bank that started as a routine question and ended with me sitting in my car in a parking garage for 25 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said he was protecting himself. I asked from what? He said, from how things might go. I asked when he had decided how things might go. He didn't answer. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds from the outside. I know it sounds like I'm painting myself as the innocent one, the wronged one, the one who never saw it coming. Maybe I didn't see it, but I also know what I did and didn't do in that marriage, and I'm not going to perform innocence I don't owe to strangers. What I will say is this. I was not the one who started the paperwork. I was not the one who opened the secret account. And I was not the one who, at a dinner with legal counsel and name cards and apple cake, decided that my spouse was a liability to be managed. That was them. All of them. I moved out in December. Not because I was asked to. I want to be clear about that. I left because I understood what the house had become and I refused to stay inside something that had been built to contain me. I took what was mine, my clothes, my grandmother's quilt, the coffee maker I'd bought before we were married, the succulent I'd kept alive on the kitchen windowsill for 3 years. I took 2 carloads and I left. It was raining. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a cold Tuesday evening rain that soaked through my jacket while I carried boxes to my car. My husband stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't help. He didn't say anything until I was on my last trip out, and then he said, "You know this didn't have to be this way." I stopped. I turned around. I looked at him for a long moment, the man I had stood next to in a rented venue in May 6 years ago and made promises to, the man whose family I had tried to join like it was a country I could earn citizenship in. I said, no, it really didn't. I drove away. The weeks after that with a kind of quiet that feels like pressure. I was staying with a friend from work, a woman who fed me soup and didn't ask too many questions and put a folded towel outside the bathroom door every morning like it was a normal thing. Because she knew I needed normal things. I went to work. I sat in meetings. I signed off on budget reports. I called my mother twice and told her the broad strokes and listened to her breathe on the other end of the line in that way she had when she was holding something back. I didn't hear from my husband for 11 days. Then one morning I woke up to 6 missed calls, all from him. No voicemails. Then 3 from my mother-in-law, 2 from an unknown number, 1 from my sister-in-law. I put the phone down and made coffee. I went to work. I sat in my car for a few minutes in the clinic parking lot and looked at the notifications and felt something I can only describe as the opposite of urgency, a kind of stillness, not peace exactly, but something like the absence of panic, like a system that had finally stopped running a program it never needed. I didn't call back. By day 3, it was 31 missed calls across multiple numbers. My husband, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, the unknown number, which I later confirmed was the family's attorney. My own attorney called me, not because they'd contacted her, because I had told her to watch for any filings. She said there was activity. She said my husband had retained a divorce attorney and filed initial paperwork. She said it looked like they were moving quickly and that given the timeline, the separate account and the unsigned waiver, there were some things we needed to discuss. I went to her office that afternoon. We sat at a small table near a window that looked out onto a parking structure, and she walked me through what she'd found. The separate account had been opened the same month the family had begun working with the estate attorneys. The timing was not coincidental, the trust restructuring, the waiver, the account. It was a sequence. Not a plan hatched in one night, but something assembled over time, quietly, while I was going to work and driving to mammogram appointments and asking for an apple cake recipe that was never going to be given to me. My attorney explained what I was entitled to under state law. She explained the difference between what they assumed I knew and what I actually had a right to. She said the unsigned waiver had been, as it turned out, significant, because I had not relinquished anything. I thought about that dinner, the legal pads, the careful nods, the way the document had been slid across the table like they were doing me a courtesy. I thought about my husband looking at the cheese board. I signed nothing. What happened after that I'm not going to lay out in full, because some of it is still ongoing and some of it belongs only to me. But I will say this, I showed up. Every meeting my attorney scheduled, I was there. Every meeting my attorney scheduled, I was there. Every document requested, I provided. Every deposition, every mediation session, every morning I had to sit across a table from people who had decided I was a non-blood family member and smile professionally, while my lawyer asked questions they had not prepared for. I was there for all of it. My mother-in-law stopped calling after day 9. My husband's calls tapered off. My sister-in-law sent one text that said she hoped we could handle this with dignity. I didn't respond. There was a mediation session in February. I drove myself. I wore the blazer I'd bought for my first director interview, the navy one with the structured shoulders that makes me feel like I know what I'm doing even when I'm not sure. I sat down across from my soon-to-be former in-laws and their attorney and my soon-to-be former husband, and I thought about that October Sunday dinner and the name card and the empty chair beside me. I thought about my mother working doubles. I thought about what she always said, which was, "You don't ask permission to take up space, you just stand in it." I stood in it. The settlement took 4 months. I'm not going to share numbers, that's not why I'm telling this. What I'll say is that the waiver I didn't sign mattered. The account I found mattered. The attorney I retained before any of them expected me to mattered. What I know now, that I didn't know that October Sunday, is that the document on the table had never been about estate planning. It's been about making sure that when the time came, and they had clearly decided the time was coming, I would have nothing. No claim, no standing, no leverage. I would just be a woman who had been briefly married into a family and had left with what fit in 2 carloads. That was what they had planned for. What they had not planned for was that I would read the document, that I would say I wanted my own attorney, that I would sit with it and not be rushed, that I would 6 months later be sitting in a mediation room with receipts, timestamps, and a lawyer who had done this before and knew exactly what questions to ask. I think about my father-in-law sometimes. Not with anger. I'm past that mostly. I think about him standing at that dinner table with his piece of paper, talking about legacy and intention, and I think he genuinely believed he had built something worth protecting. I think he also genuinely believed I was not part of what was worth protecting. He was wrong on the second point, and that wrong must cost them. I am 31 years old. I live in an apartment I chose myself, with windows that face east and get morning light I didn't know I needed. I kept the succulent. I finally got a coffee maker with a timer so it's ready when I wake up. Small things, but they're mine in a way that the last 6 years, for all their size and furniture and Connecticut candles, never quite were. I don't regret what I did in that mediation room. I don't regret what I did. In that mediation room, I don't regret not signing. I don't regret the 2 carloads or the Tuesday rain or standing in a parking lot somewhere between one life and another. What I regret is smaller and harder to name. I regret the version of me that spent 6 years trying to earn a seat at a table that had already been decided. The version who asked twice for the apple cake recipe. The version who sat in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours and thought it meant something about belonging. It didn't mean nothing. I know that now too. It just meant something different than I thought. If there's a lesson in this, and I'm suspicious of neat lessons, because real life doesn't tend to produce them, it might be this. The moment someone hands you a document at a dinner and tells you it doesn't change anything, read it. Read every word. Then ask yourself who benefits from your signature. And if the answer isn't you, put the pen down. That's all. That's the whole thing. The apple cake was good though. I'll give them that.